My name is James D. Schultz, and I was a torpedoman second class by the time I got out. And so it was kind of a streamlined submarine at that point. I don't know how you might have got a couple of more knots of speed out of it, but most of the time when you were underwater, you weren't going very fast anyway. You're only doing about 6 or 7 knots, which maybe is 10 miles an hour. I think the fastest we ever went, and they call that series the battery, where you got 2 batteries that are driving the motors, and usually you're not really draining those batteries. But if you series them, you're really going as fast as you can. So the fastest I think we ever went was about 14 knots, and everything was shaking. It wasn't a good idea. The engine rooms were just deafening. It just, you didn't, if you were walking through there, like I would go to the after torpedo room to talk to my buddies back there, you'd have to go through the engine rooms. Well, the engine men in there, they had earmuffs on. And I don't know how much that helped, but it was just very, very loud. Now, I made a recording that you might find interesting. And I have a copy of it on disc. And what it was, you might find this interesting. I don't know why, but we were in the Caribbean. And I had one of those old cassette tape recorders, not the 8-track, but the smaller ones. I said, you know what, I'm going to record what happens in this control room when we submerge the ship. So I was in the control room, and I asked the officer on duty, I said, is it okay if I record this? He said, yeah, he didn't care. So I recorded all these conversations going on with the officers, and it was very interesting because they were saying, well, tonight, here's what we're going to do tonight. Here's our game plan. Here's what our, what we're going to do. And he said, we're kind of a target. And then he said, let's submerge the ship. So you hear the klaxon going off, and you'll hear the air rushing into the different tanks and blowing out of the tanks as they filled up with water. And it went through the process of all the commands that happen in that control room when you're going down to 55 feet, which is where you're supposed to go initially. And you might find that interesting. I have a CD of that, and I'll send it to you. But the other part of it is, after that, it was kind of quiet in the control room, so I picked it up, the recorder, and I walked through the galley berthing compartment into the engine rooms. You mentioned it. It's roaring, just unbelievable sound. I recorded back there at a different time. We were actually on the surface at that time, but the roar is deafening, and it overwhelms the recorder. And then eventually I got through the engine rooms and into the after torpedo room, and it's quiet back there. So anyway, it's an interesting recording of what actually happens when you submerge the ship. Right. You mentioned batteries. I have one last thing that I mentioned about batteries. They were in the bottom of the ship, and the crew kind of lived on top of the batteries. Up in the officers' country, their batteries were below them. Crew quarters, another set of batteries back there. So it's very important that those batteries don't get salt water on them. And the reason is as soon as that happens, they'll generate chlorine gas. So I mentioned that it was very rough around Cape Hatteras. We were coming back from the Med one time, and we were on the surface, and water came over the top of the sail, and where the engines suck in air, there's a big valve in that big sail you see on deck level. I think it's a 36-inch diameter valve. All the diesels are sucking air. So water comes in there and fills up. All of a sudden there's water coming in there, and salt water. So I'm laying in my rack, sleeping, trying to sleep, right above the batteries, and water comes flying out of the ventilation ducts, salt water. I'm going, that's not good, it's salty. So by the time it took me to jump out of the rack, because the first thing you want to do is take a mattress and cover that hatch up that goes to the batteries. You don't want water going down there. So we grabbed a mattress, my feet are wet, cover that mattress up right away. I mean the battery hatch. And fortunately they got it under control pretty quick, but we lost our air conditioning after that, and it was quite an experience. But yeah, there's a lot of batteries, and they weigh about a ton each. And there's, I think, over 100 of them in each compartment. And of course, the nuclear submarines don't need that anymore. That's a thing of the past. But those guys in World War II had to deal with all that. I mean, that's how they were all the same design. And once the salt water hits those batteries, you're making chlorine gas. So good. Some crazy time.